And if at some point I scream, "Come on, people, she climbed a fence to be here," then you'll know.
I did. The gate at the top of the driveway of my apartment complex is not working at the moment. So there was pure panic when I got here, trying to open the gate, jumping up high to try and press the button to make it open and crawling down low. So it was terrifying, but I'm here.
We're ready to go. And I want to welcome all of you to another edition of SIBA's Reader Meet Writer. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm your host. I'm the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Prize from SIBA, and I'm also the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina. I want to talk a little bit about SIBA. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. So maybe you are here tonight because you are already a fan of Jaclyn's, or maybe you are here tonight because you found out about this event because one of these 700 or so bookstores invited you, sent you an email, you saw it on their calendar. Please, if that is the case, reward them tonight by purchasing this book from the independent bookstore that brought you here. And I'll talk about this book and the author in just a moment. Reader Meet Writer is a series that we've been doing since July. I think we've done dozens of these and we're having a blast. And this is the kind of event that normally we would be in your bookstore doing this. Jaclyn, who is now joining us from Australia, maybe would have traveled to New York or Los Angeles or Miami or another city where maybe you would come in contact with her. Maybe not, but now's your chance to hear about this book from the author herself. So we can't be in a bookstore, but we can do this and we're having a blast. So thank you for joining us. And thank you for supporting authors and bookstores in this way when we can't all be together in person. And I want to invite you to join us for our next event, which is Thursday, May 6th at 7 p.m. It'll be a discussion with Josephine Camino-Soria about her new book, Sobra Mesa, a memoir of food and love and 13 courses. So if you're a fan of Frances May's or food writing or family books surrounding culinary pleasures and delights and exploration, this will be the book for you. So please join us for that. So tonight we are joined by Jaclyn Moriarty. And if you have questions for her at any point during tonight's conversation, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and ask your question there. When you have your question, make sure you mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore. And I will mention both when I ask Jaclyn your question at the end of our show. So stick around for that. So I want to introduce tonight's guest. Jaclyn Moriarty is the award-winning author of uniquely creative and readable books for adults and young readers, including The Year of Secret Assignments, the Colors of Madeleine trilogy, and the extremely inconvenient adventures of Bronte Mettlestone. One of the talented and popular Moriarty sisters, including Liane and Nicola, Jaclyn lives in Sydney, Australia. She is very fond of chocolate, blueberries, and sleep. The Stolen Prince of Cloudburst is her most recent novel, which Kirkus Reviews calls splendidly entertaining. And I can say that it is, and I can also say that she has an incredible website that I really enjoyed spending time on. So Jaclyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. And that's such a lovely introduction. You speak so beautifully. Oh. When I'm doing something like this and someone does a nice introduction, I just start to think, you just speak for the rest of it. You're so articulate.
Well,
so I will try to
practice. I've done so many of these events, but I appreciate you saying that, especially because you have such a charming Australian accent, and people are probably used to hearing me speak, but they probably tuned in just to hear you talk, knowing that you're doing this in Australia. What time is it in Australia right now?
It's 9 a.m. So that's quite civilized for most people, but it's early for me. I'm not a morning person. I think you said sleep is one of my favorite things. So I like staying up very, very late as I can, and then sleeping as long as I can in the morning. But luckily I have a 14-year-old who needs to get to school. So I have to get up for him. So I took him to school, then I came back and climbed the gate.
Well, speaking of 14-year-olds, I was telling you in our virtual green room where we have, all the M&Ms in the deli tray and all the cool exotic beers and liqueurs before the event starts, like a rock concert. Speaking of 14-year-olds, when this book arrived, my 14-year-old niece was visiting us, and our 14-year-old niece just read The Stranger. She's reading these classic novels, and we also have a 6-year-old and 5-year-old daughters. And when this book arrived, I opened it up and I just began reading from it, and everybody was into it. And our 14-year-old niece, when she left, she was like, so is that book staying here? Because, Juniper and Early, my daughters, there, it's like more for me. And I was like, no, the book is staying here. We're going to enjoy this book together. So it must feel good to write a YA novel that, and I'm sure you've had this experience beyond what I've just told you, to write a YA novel that 5-year-olds are like, Daddy, can we read that book tonight? 14-year-old jaded niece is like, can I take that book home with me? And the father is, yeah, we can read this book tonight. How do you respond to being able to appeal to that broad of an audience?
It's so lovely. I know you said some of that before, and I was so happy to hear it again. I was so happy before, and then the happiness levels increased. Thank you so much. It's lovely. And thank you to say hello to your daughters and your niece for me, because that's wonderful to hear. It's the greatest pleasures writing for that age group. And that age group is a broad range, but I think older teenagers who have moved on beyond middle grade fiction sometimes still like to read it. And I still like reading middle grade fiction because you want escape and you want to feel like a child again. And the younger kids are so much smarter and brighter than we realize. So I wrote it thinking this is maybe for 9 to 12-year-olds. And then I started hearing from 14-year-olds and younger kids. And the younger kids, they're always impressing you, I think, aren't they? But I love hearing from kids. And I write for adults sometimes too. Mm-hmm. And adults will send letters and they'll say, they'll be very kind about my books, but they're always very careful and rational and full of qualifications. So I love hearing the passion of young people. I remember getting a letter once from a 12-year-old girl who said, I'm writing to let you know that your book is my #1 all-time favorite book ever written in the entire world. And then on the next line, she said, you may like to know that previously my #1 all-time favorite best books in the world have been. And then she started listing the whole page of the letter, and over to the next page was her #1 all-time favorite books in the world. And I loved the fact that just for that little moment, my book had that place in her heart. And obviously in a week that she'd have a new favorite book, but she wasn't trying to be careful and say, well, this is one of my books that I enjoyed. She just said, this is my #1 all-time favorite. So I loved it.
Yeah, and I think that's part, and I want to talk about, for people who are like, get to the book, I want to talk, that is what's so wonderful about the exuberance of youth, is that little girl is willing to write down all her previous favorite books. And it reminds me of the writing assignment that Esther is given by her teacher early on in the novel to write something about her family and how and write a secret, and how willing young people are to really engage with things that those adults like myself might think, well, I don't have time to write down all my previous favorite books. I don't have time to write a letter about myself. I'm not going to indulge that desire. But kids are so open to that kind of exchange with a piece of art or with an author. That is one thing about YA readers and YA books that I find particularly enchanting, for lack of a better word.
There's also honesty in young people too that we lose as we become more cautious. So another letter that I received said, I'm writing to let you know I love your book. And the next line was, but don't let it go to your head. And then she told me a few books that are a little bit better than my book. So there's passion and there's honesty. And I think that's what I love about, that's one of the things I love about young people. But being able to share about yourself that when you talk about letter writing was a big part of my life when I was a teenager, in that I had a friend who I didn't really know very well. She was more acquaintance at my high school, and she left the school and went to a different high school when I was 15. And for some reason, she and I decided, let's keep in touch with each other by writing letters to each other, even though she still lived in the next suburb over. And from the age of 14 to probably 21, we wrote letters regularly to each other, sometimes 10-page letters, where we were telling each other everything that was happening and the secrets and the things we were sad about, trying to make each other laugh. And this friend was someone who wanted to be an artist. So one of the special things about it was she would always cover the envelope in decorations. So I'd get these beautiful, funny, entertaining letters at the same time as pieces of art. And we became very close friends as a result of that. So like you say, grown-ups don't get time to do that kind of thing anymore, but it's a way of connecting.
It's funny you say that, because your book is also a very beautiful book. There's all these different embellished parts of it. And it feels very intimate. It's these short chapters. They feel very, it's very episodically written, but it feels very intimate and very close. And Esther's the narrator, so she's talking directly to us. So it feels like that kind of intimate exchange between Esther and us, the speaker and the reader. Can you tell us a little bit about the novel? Like, give us a quick synopsis of the novel?
Sure, but I'm glad you mentioned how beautiful the illustrations are. This cover is just the most beautiful thing I ever saw. When my publisher sent me an email with a picture of the cover, I was walking through a park, and I stopped and sat down on a park bench to look at the email, and tears came down because I loved it so much. I was so embarrassed to be sitting there in a park going, look at my beautiful cover, but also so different too. I also love, in case people are interested, this is the Australian cover, which is completely different. So that's it is. It's completely different, and I adore it too. It's just a whole different approach. But okay, what is it about? That's what you asked me?
Yes, synopsis, as much as you want to tell us. And there's a lot going on, so.
Yes, so I have to get better at summarizing it. So I'm trying to work on that. So it's about Esther, who is a middle sister with an older sister and a younger sister, and she is about to start a new year back at boarding school with her sisters. And when she arrives at boarding school, she's very surprised to discover that the mountains that surround the school, which are usually a beautiful world of glaciers and tea shops and crystal fairies, are now swarming with shadow mages, the wicked, scary kind of magician in the area. And she also, by eavesdropping, discovers that there is in her class at school an undercover spellbinder, and the spellbinder is somebody who can spellbind shadow mages and protect people. So she decides she wants to figure out who the girl is in her class who is the undercover spellbinder, who's there specifically to protect the school. She also finds out that there's a rumor around that her new teacher is an ogre. So.
And the teacher, we can talk about the teacher a little bit later, but the teacher to me represents and I don't know how it was growing up in Australia, but in the United States, we would get like maybe a formal letter, or we would do like a school visit to see whose class you were going to be in, where you would like find your name on a piece of paper. And if you didn't know the teacher, like if it was a new teacher, the anxiety was so high. And so for Esther, this is the new teacher, and the teacher is from a particular part of this world that is known to be the place where ogres are from. So this little girl is convinced that her teacher is going to be an ogre, and then the teacher arrives, and there are a number of complications and interesting things, and she's a character unto herself. And then also when Esther arrives back at school, she discovers that her two best friends from school are not there. And can you talk a little bit about, we mentioned at the top of the show how YA opens this space of enchantment. But what I thought was particularly wonderful about the book and about Esther as a character and Esther's voice was her willingness to embrace mystery and exploration. You mentioned the scene where she eavesdrops, and that's a very particular way that she hears that information. Her wonder about her friends, her wondering about who the spellbinder is in her class, the way she is drawn to new kids. And can you talk about like Esther as a character and tell us a little bit about her, and also what it is inside of her that sets her apart from her older sister and her younger sister, this sense of wonder, this sense of this willingness to explore?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think part of that is why part of that aspect of Esther is why the book is called The Stolen Prince of Cloudburst. So it's not really about the Stolen Prince of Cloudburst. And people are still occasionally, I've got a friend who every time he mentions this book, he says, I don't understand why it's called The Stolen Prince of Cloudburst. It's not about the Stolen Prince of Cloudburst. I mean, it's a good book, but it's not about the Stolen Prince of Cloudburst. But the reason it's called The Stolen Prince of Cloudburst is because the Stolen Prince of Cloudburst is somebody who Esther vaguely knows and has read about in the news, and she's fascinated by him. And he had been stolen by pirates as a baby, and now he's been returned to his king and queen parents. So that's the kind of magic and adventure that she is intrigued by, and that she sees in the world around her all the time. So she's someone who's always been in love with magic and yearned to be a magical person herself, because she's in a world where there's mostly regular people and occasionally magical people. And she was introduced in another book, just briefly introduced in a book called The Extremely Inconvenient Adventures of Bronte Mettlestone, where the main character in that book happens to visit her at this boarding school, and this middle sister Esther longs to be a spellbinder herself because she's so drawn to the idea of being magical. And if you're a spellbinder, your toenails occasionally turn blue. So Esther spends a lot of time staring at her toenails, hoping that they will turn blue. So after I wrote that book, I thought I would like to spend more time with Esther, this person who has that yearning for magic, which I think a lot of us have, or I do anyway, that what, you want, when there's something unexplained, you don't always want it to be explained, because that shuts off the magic. That kind of, in the 18th century, there were scientists who were explaining so much of the world, and the poets were getting so angry with them, saying, stop it, you are spoiling. That's a rainbow. Don't try and explain it. Those are stars. They're magical twinkling things. Don't, just everyone, shut up. So I think I have a little bit of that myself. I don't want it to be explained because I want to keep believing in magic. And for Esther, as a middle sister, that is important because she feels like she's just an ordinary girl herself. And her two sisters are extraordinary in their own different ways. So her older sister Imogen is somebody who is a very strong, forthright character who knows her place in the world and is a champion swimmer and takes control of situations. And her younger sister Astrid is somebody who has this power where she can read people's minds. She knows exactly what people are thinking, not exactly read their minds, but she knows exactly what they're thinking. She knows if they're telling the truth or telling a lie. So Esther is someone with extraordinary sisters who she adores and she's very proud of, but as a result of that, and her two best friends who have left the school also are both extremely talented people, a musician and an athlete. So she thinks I'm just an ordinary person, and I love my friends and my sisters, but in a way it's the position that a lot of people have. If you're a middle child with brothers or sisters who are amazing, or even if you have friends or family who are extraordinary and you don't think that you have the same talents, you can not realize that you are special in your own way. You can just assume, and it's not to do with, I was thinking about how people who love and are proud of the people around them, they're not jealous or bitter or competitive. They just decide, okay, those are the people in the spotlight, so I should be in the shadows. And so they look for magic and wonder as something to give them pleasure in life and to give them purpose, but they think that they have themselves do not have that ability and they're not as important. And so I wanted to explore the fact that of course you are that important, even if the people around you are also magnificent, you are too.
Well, I appreciate that. As a middle child, Esther particularly resonated with me. And as a father to two young girls, our girls are 6 and 5, Esther's willingness to seek, imagine, and eventually confront magic in some very dangerous ways. There's a quite terrifying scene relatively early in the novel in the swimming pool. But her willingness to pursue magic speaks, I think, to the child's wonder. And it's not hard as an adult to read a book like this and say, why am I not more like that? It's so easy for me to tell my daughters, like, hey girls, we're going on an adventure. We're going to go to the post office and they've got a machine where you can touch these buttons and stamps will come out. And they're like, what? You can convince them that there's magic everywhere. And I think that's what Esther's character, that's how she serves the narrative so well, is that she is engaged in searching for magic. And I also want to let our viewers know that Esther and her sisters are also champion poker players. Where did that idea come from?
That was just I don't even know where it came from. When in the other book where we met them briefly in the Bronte book, I wanted that they're passionate and lovely, and they're sweet, lovely girls, and so I wanted something completely different, and so that gives them, suddenly they're loving and kind and playful, and then suddenly they sit down and they're fierce and determined, and because I think there's always more to people than we think. So that was the more than that I just like the idea of them being sharp and ruthless in their own ways.
And there's mentions of them having their poker practice and that the sisters are kind of interacting. And it feels almost very, their family feels a little Victorian, kind of the flighty mother, the father who's more academic, the sisters playing poker. It feels, in some instances, the family, as eccentric as it is, feels kind of staid and Victorian. At least that's how I picture them. But the image of these 3 little girls being card shark, these hard-nosed poker players, when we know so much about magic in this world, is such a delicious contrast. And I wanted to ask you, and this might be a tough question to answer, but I don't know quite how to phrase it. As a writer myself, I'm always thinking about, and I write, kind of boring, plain old realistic fiction. I present the world as it is. But what you do here is very fantastical and very exciting and very magical. But you don't do it in chunks. You don't like say, this is the island where the ogres live, and these are the rules of this island, and here's what happens if you go to this island. You kind of introduce us to the world as we encounter the world. And there are these little pockets where we learn about the world that never feel heavy. It never feels like a ton of chunky exposition, which I feel is what happens in a lot of fantasy writing. You get a big chunk of exposition that kind of kills the narrative. But what you do and this is a craft discussion that I hope our viewers will be interested in. What you do so masterfully is you have this really powerful narrator in Esther, and the narrative just moves. I mean, the story just rolls. It's almost like unrolling a spool of thread and just letting it go as fast as it can. And when we need to know something in order to understand the world, you just slip it in. Were you conscious of doing that, of kind of meting out the rules of the world only as we would need to know them, so that you weren't smothering that forceful narrative that's kind of making us turn the pages?
So nice of you to say that. But you're making me glow a lot of the time. And you don't write boring books. You don't write boring books. It's a really interesting question about how to do world building without overwhelming it, and I do have to work on it, overwhelming the manuscript, the narrative. I do have to work on not doing that. I think what I found effective in this book for me, and in these books, because it's part of a series where each of the books is standalone, and I discovered that this was effective for me. So what happened was, in my previous books, I had always planned them and written quite extensive plans. And with each book that I wrote, the plan was getting longer and longer. And I would go to a cafe and spend all morning planning with different colored textures and markers and pencils and drawing pictures and brainstorming and creating a big plan. And I would sit down and work out a whole part of the world that I was writing about. And sometimes, so that by the time I got to, I think it was my 10th book, I spent a whole year doing the plan for it and had a 200-page plan. And meanwhile, while all this was happening, two of my sisters, I've come from a family of 6 kids, and 2 of my sisters are also authors. And my sister Liane is also is a very successful author of New York Times bestsellers, and her books have been made into TV series. And I'm very proud of her. But when she writes her books, she never plans them at all. She just sits down and starts writing and waits to see what will happen. So much so that with one of her books, when I read it, I got to the end and I called her up to say I loved it. And I said, I couldn't believe this person turned out to be the murderer. And she said, I know, I couldn't believe it either. Because she just waits to see what's going to happen. So with this, the first book that I wrote in this world, I decided I'm going to try that myself, because it's the way I used to write stories when I was little, and I never wrote a plan then. It was like you were saying, that was how you found the magic and the wonder in the world. You wrote and you waited to see where you ended up. So I decided with the Bronte Mettlestone book, I'm not going to write a plan. I just had the idea of cloudberry tea because somebody had sent me a message. A reader had sent me an email saying, I'm drinking a cup of cloudberry tea as I write to you. And I wrote back and said, I have never heard of cloudberry tea, but it sounds like something in a children's book, and I'm going to use that in a children's book one day. It sounds magical. So that's all I had was, there's a canister of cloudberry tea in a stroller with a baby in it. So that's all I had. And I decided that Bronte is going to go and visit 10 different aunts across the kingdoms and empires, and that I would go to a different cafe in my neighborhood to write each chapter of the book, so that going to a different cafe was like going to a different part of the kingdom or empire to meet a different aunt. And I let Bronte tell me the story of what was happening in each of these places. So to me, it felt like, some people say this about writing, that there's an idea is like a butterfly that you follow, and or an idea is in the landscape or the environment. And I know Indigenous Australians talk about the dream time. The dreaming is their storytellers pull down the stories from the landscape around them, and just so there's something, it's lovely and as an idea, and it's also pleasing as an author to think I don't have to do any work. I just listen, or here you go, and I'll write it. So that seemed to work in an unexpected way, because I was finding out about the world at the same time as Bronte was. So it wasn't that I was thinking I will give this much information now and save this till later. It was that I was finding it out at the same time. And then with the Stolen Prince and then with the other books in the series, because I had loved that so much, I really enjoy doing that. Then the same thing happened. I just said, I want to get to know this character, and this character will tell me about the world as she needs to. So it was like I lifted that responsibility from my own shoulders and gave it to Esther to tell me about the world.
Well, it's almost like you're in the ceiling above the teacher's lounge, eavesdropping on your characters and learning about the world in the same way that Esther learns some of the information she learns in your book. And how did you? I want to ask 2 more questions. We've got some questions coming in, and I want to get to. And I wouldn't be surprised if my little ones come running in here at the very end to at least lay eyes on the beloved author of their current read. But how did you settle on Esther as the narrator in terms of her being first person narrator? She's so charming. She's so smart. She's so inquisitive, but she's also so incredibly observant. And there's nothing cute or like, it's just a great narrative voice. And you do such a great job with these short chapters, um, keeping the momentum going in a long book. And it never feels overwhelming because the chapters are so short and Esther's voice is so sharp and so clear and readable. And she's really funny. She's funny and there's funny observations. So tell me about her as a narrator, how you decided to narrate first person and your decision to structure the novel with these very short chapters.
Oh, thank you. I really liked all those things you just said. Thank you. I think maybe the short chapters, I like short chapters myself when I'm reading, and I think hopefully kids like them because you feel like you've achieved something. I think reading to my son when he was little, I always preferred reading we preferred reading the short chapter books. You can say, I've read 57 chapters and that's a huge accomplishment. And that you don't feel like you're going to be lost in it for a long time. And Esther, I think partly hearing from children and meeting kids when I go to schools and things like that, and realizing just how bright and varied and imaginative children are, always brighter and more imaginative than we think as grown-ups. So I wanted us to take Esther seriously, and her voice just came to me if I try to spend a bit of time thinking about a person by wandering around the neighborhood. And I live close to Sydney Harbour, so I like to walk across the harbour bridge and look at the water and just wait, looking at water for some reason. I don't know if that works for you too, or do you have ways that
I mostly just stare in the screen and panic and desperation.
Because even I found once with one of my books that I was trying to write because I was running out of time. The deadline was coming up, and I was thinking, it's not going very well. Something's wrong, but I have to keep writing because the deadline's coming up. And then I made myself stop altogether, and I went and sat on the grass by the harbour, a little quiet corner in the harbour, and made myself turn off my phone and do nothing but look at the sun sparkling on the water for 1 hour without even thinking about it. And just doing that for 1 hour, when I came back, suddenly it was all working again. So.
That's brilliant. Well, I want to take some questions from some of our viewers, and Melina has not a question, but an observation and a note of gratitude. And I will echo Melina's note of gratitude. Melina says, not a question, but short chapters are also great for kids who don't want to go to bed until they read just one more chapter. So from parents, thank you. And that is true. With this book, my 6-year-old would say, Daddy, one more chapter. And I would say, you promise? If I do one more chapter, lights out. And I was happy to do one more chapter because the 5 minutes to read one chapter. So it was really brilliantly done. So from one parent, from Melina, and from this parent, thank you. Rachel has a question. Rachel asks, as someone who writes beautifully adult, middle grade, and YA, realistic, and fantasy, is there a sweet spot for you? Do things happening in your own life affect which genre you want to write in at any given time? Thank you for all of your amazing books. So they are talking about all of the things that you do, and you have done many, many things. You have a lot of books and several different genres. So how do you know what a book's going to be?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Rachel. I think a lot of it's not really a good idea, my approach. I think you're supposed to, publishers have been saying from the start, could you just choose a lane and stay with it? And you're supposed to build a brand so readers know what to expect. But I suffer from extreme indecisiveness, and I think it's because I'm a Libra. Libras are indecisive, so a lot of it is just that I can't make up my mind which thing I'm going to do. But also, it's the sweet spot for me is always books that are as realistic as possible, that have magic in the corners, and that's because of what we were talking about earlier. I think that I just want to believe in magic, and I want there to be magic in our world. So I find it hard to write a book without there being something a little bit magic, but I don't want it to be pure fantasy and all completely out of the realm of possibility, because I want to be able to visit there myself, and I want kids to be able to visit if they want to. So I love books where you can get through a crack and find your way there.
Well, speaking of kids, I was corrected. I said our comment was from Melina, and Melina jumped on and said that was actually from Melina's parent. This is Melina now. And then Melina jumped on and another question, and Melina asks, will there be another book in the series?
Thank you. Well, thank you to Melina and her parent. Hi, Melina. And yes, there will be. And I was thinking about the short chapter thing too. Partly that's because I was writing every chapter in a cafe, and you don't want to stay in a cafe for too long. So I wanted to complete it before, when you start to see other people coming in, and you don't want to take up a table for too long. So that's very practical. Although I did end up going to a lot of, even though I was supposed to be going to a different cafe, I kept going to this little cafe, which is a chocolate shop, a chocolate cafe, which has a big table in the middle of the room, and chocolates all around the walls, chocolates all over the table, and a chandelier made of teacups. And there's just enough space to have a hot chocolate and write. So I read a lot of the chapters in that place. And yes, I would like to keep writing books set in this world for as long as I can, because as soon as I finish one, or as long as I'm able to, because as soon as I finish one, I want to explore a different part of it. So I have just finished writing another book, which I think is going to be called the Astonishing Chronicles of Oscar from Elsewhere, which is about a boy on a skateboard who finds his way from our world into the world of the kingdoms and empires. Because that's what I always want to do, get a connection from our world to that world. So I think that's what it's going to be called. But anyway, and I've got an idea for another one too. So I'd love to keep writing.
We have another question. That's good news. That might be back in this world. Susan asks 2 questions. Her store is community bookstore in I hear feet. Community bookstore in Brooklyn. And Susan asks, are middle children endangered in literature? There are often missing people in your books. What draws you to write about the missing?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I'm so happy to meet your daughters. It's so lovely to see you girls. Thank you for coming in. The missing characters in fiction, middle children, I'm fascinated by. I think you talked about being a middle child. I'm the second of 6 kids. So in the end, I became a senior figure in the family rather than a middle child. Because I have some authority, I'm second in command. But for a long time, I was the middle child because there were 3 kids and then another 3 kids. And so I was the middle child of the first 3 kids. And I remember, and I was very shy when I was little. And the sisters around me were much more outgoing, but I do remember, I wasn't neglected or abandoned or anything, but I remember my dad had a nickname for all 3 of us, and his nickname for my older sister was Princess, and his nickname for my younger sister was Treasure, and his nickname for me was Rumbies. So there was a princess and a treasure and a rumbies, and apparently I used to make a rumbling noise like when I was a baby, so that's why I was rumbies. So I feel like I was a middle child at that time, and I just like to talk about the quiet people and the shy people, and as Susan said, the missing people, the people we don't hear about that much, and give them voices, because just because they're shy doesn't mean they don't have powerful personalities and characters behind the shyness.
And we have our last question.
Okay, the child that was named Treasure, how did her nickname was Treasure. How did she get that nickname?
Oh, that's a good question. She was my sister, Katie, and she was a treasure because she was so special. You know, treasure is something magical, like you know what treasure is. So she was like, to my dad, she was like a box full of treasure. And my dad made me feel like a princess in the treasure too. But it was just funny that he gave her that nickname. I used to tell this when I was little. My older sister used to tell stories to me, and I used to tell stories to the next sister down, and that next sister down was the treasure, Katie. And Katie and I shared a bedroom, and each night before we fell asleep, I would tell her a story. And one night she said to me, "Where are you getting these stories from?" And I said, "Well, I've got fairies who live under my pillow, and they tell me the stories." And my sister said to me, "Why don't I have fairies who live under my pillow?" And I said, "Oh, I think that's because the fairies think you're a witch." So, so that was a very mean thing of me to say, and it upset her for a long time apparently. So, but I think everybody has fairies who live under their pillow who will tell them stories, and if they want to listen.
You have one more question, Jennifer? No, Jennifer's got a question. Then we have to go.
Why was the other door's name Princess?
Princess because her name was Princess because she's a princess. Well, she's like the queen of the family, really. She's the number one child in the family. I don't know if you find it in your family. Is the number one child the queen of the family?
I'm the number one child.
Okay. Are you a little bit bossy? No, I didn't think you would be. I did not think you would be.
That's when she's in a very bad mood.
Okay. Well, well, thank you so much, Jaclyn, for indulging these questions at the end. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us and asked such wonderful questions. And please check out this book. We are loving it. Everyone in the house loves it. And please join us next time for Reader Meet Writer on May 6th. And thank you so much, Jaclyn, for giving us so much time.
Oh, thank you so much, Wiley, for wonderful questions. And hello and goodbye to your daughters. It's really lovely to meet you girls. And it was so lovely to meet you. Thank you for the questions. And thank you to everybody listening.
Good night. Bye. Good night, everybody.